Welcome to the Everything Compliance crossover with the great women in compliance. It is my incredible honor to be with the four amazing ladies joining me today so that we can talk about everything compliance and how great women in compliance think. I am joined by Karen Woody, Karen Moore, Hemma Lomax, and Lisa Fine. We are going to dive into the stories of the day, things you need to know, and of course, fan favorite, the rants and raves at the end. So let's get right into it. Karen Moore, why don't you talk to us about what you're thinking?
Yes. So I would like to talk about the U.S. Constitution 10th Amendment on state rights. But I'm going to preface this by saying that I completely understand and respect how companies need to frame their public policy in line with current administration and political mood and regulatory change. So let me just kind of put it within that context. But I do want to focus a little bit on state rights in the face of a lot of federal executive action at the moment that has compliance professionals kind of scurrying a bit and wondering where the wind is blowing and what that means for them. Just as a reminder, the 10th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution reserves to the state rights that are not specifically allocated to the federal government. And that gives a lot of power to U.S. states. It's a good reminder, especially for those of us who haven't really done constitutional law issues since law school, those of us who just maybe remember our eighth grade civics classes. It's a good reminder that even though we count on the federal government to represent all of the union itself is made up of individual states, and those states are comprised of varying constituencies. We speak pretty easily of red states and blue states and even purple states. It's maybe simplified, but also kind of an effective visualization of the idea that there isn't kind of a one size fits all within this country. Founding fathers recognized that, did not want to devolve too much power to the federal government, and reserve quite a lot of authority to the states. A democracy may grant each of us a voice, but that voice is more powerful at a local level than a national level, arguably. Thinking about the current climate where the administration may not be seeking to unite the country, where governance by edict or executive order seems to be an effort to bypass the people even more radically. It's helpful to remember that states have a lot of authority to enact legislation and policies which more closely reflect the mood and will of their own population, regardless of what's being done at a federal level. For us, for compliance professionals, it can be frustrating on the one hand, but a good reminder and opportunity on the other. On the frustration side, those of us who've been working in data privacy, especially in the last few years, especially in the aftermath of the GDPR in the EU, which has forced a lot of us to really examine and focus on data privacy issues within our organization. We're already aware of the difficulty in monitoring privacy laws that are emerging in all 50 states in the absence of a federal law. So it's kind of like the opposite argument there. But it's also sparked robust conversations at a local level as to where privacy should balance commercial realities with social pressures, with human rights. And so that kind of state law approach is something that we grapple with, but we should also value and appreciate. G has taken a little bit more of a hit on the federal level. Last month, the federal government withdrew a proposed rule that would have required government contractors to publicly disclose greenhouse gas emissions and set emission reduction goals. On the commercial front, we've already seen the SEC's climate disclosure rule suspended under threat from lawsuits. It could be further delayed, watered down, eliminated. I don't know by the current administration. Certainly, there are conservative commissioners at the SEC which have already made known their own views. They've been pretty vocal that disclosure requirements represent regulatory overreach. And under a new Republican leadership, we may expect to see further limitations on effort to create compliance obligations on climate disclosure, something that remains to be seen. And Karen Woody, I know that you may have some thoughts there as well. We've got this federal mood back off of ESG reporting requirements for companies, we see some states taking up the reins. Not surprisingly, a couple of years ago, late 2023, I think California introduced a climate disclosure bill. And just last week, we saw the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act introduced in the New York Senate. So we're starting to see states taking up the slack for compliance officers that have ESG responsibilities, preparing for assessments, management, and disclosures under state laws, if not federal laws, should still be front of mind, not to mention current and upcoming requirements coming out of the EU. The last illustrative area that I wanted to tackle is the grim mood on the DEI front, which is kind of filtered around so many different areas. I almost don't know where to start, but Trump has quickly set the mood and the message. We've got several executive orders, but they've effectively eliminated a broad scope of DEI programs and policies in the federal government, eliminated a lot of positions, and some of those programs and policies have further reaching impact on private businesses and citizens. What's more worrisome maybe for some of us is that he has effectively given permission to businesses and states to follow suit. It's been pretty discouraging to see a growing number of companies dumping existing DEI programs. It's also discouraging to see that while states had the authority to develop their own public policies in this area, an increasing number of states are enacting anti-DEI policies. The focus so far seems to be on eliminating DEI programs in public agencies and federal and state contractors. Republican lawmakers, I saw in a recent report, in more than 30 states have introduced or passed more than 100 bills to either restrict or regulate DEI initiatives in the current legislative session. So I'm feeling pretty down on the DEI front. And when I look at the number of companies, including some pretty high profile companies that really banged the DEI drum in the past, starting to eliminate or curtail their own programs, I despair until I see a company like Costco, which last month bucked the trend when their shareholders by a very large majority rejected a proposal to end the DEI programs at Costco. So there's a little bit of light. Regardless of that, we should remember that DEI has kind of been this tag, this sort of popular trend, if you will, which maybe hides some of the underlying importance of examining our own anti-discrimination, level playing field type of program. So for compliance officers, I think in the wake of what's going on in this area, we've got an opportunity and a challenge to raise these conversations at a senior level with the leadership of the company, including the board, to have meaningful discussions about what the company stands for. Formally calling a program DEI with separate mandates and staffing doesn't mean that a company just shouldn't embed equal opportunity, level playing field approach throughout the organization. Doesn't mean that a company shouldn't be challenging its own potential unfair and often unconsciously discriminatory actions in HR practices and as part of company culture. To me, there's a real opportunity on the compliance front to get out and engage, not just with federal practices, but also on the state level. I don't know about all of you, but sometimes I think that I've maybe neglected a little bit the engagement, active engagement with my company's corporate affairs colleagues on their plans and how they're reacting to policy changes. Also bear in mind at the state level, there's legislation, but there's also gubernatorial executive orders that can be implemented, attorney general lawsuits, ballot initiatives, and those can swing either way. So I do feel like as compliance officers, we have a role to play. Certainly as individual citizens, we have a role to play. And I think we need to kind of be actively pursuing that.
So, Karen, I'm going to start it off asking you one of the things that surprised me in one of the executive orders was the request from the executive branch for organizations under their control to look for companies, including I think it's up to 9 was the number if I have it correct, to potentially target to look at their DEI practices, whether that is I think it was on the list was publicly traded, large non-for-profits, and then some of the government in and of itself. And I think that puts compliance officers in really tough positions because if they are facing what essentially is an investigation and we don't know who's going to be targeted, there's a real need essentially to balance how you're talking about respect and equality that could essentially get you in trouble. So, what would your recommendations be for that person who's stuck in that place?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, Christy. And we even saw it a couple months ago in the Texas judges' questioning of DEI practices. This was even before the current administration sat in its current seats, saying that DEI practices shouldn't come into play in the appointment of a monitorship. And we saw at the same time the Texas AG questioning in Spirit, not the airlines, but the company that was supplying parts to Boeing, whether an investigation into whether their DEI practices meant that there was lower quality people on the factory floor. And we're starting to see that now filter into the current administration's positions, that DEI has created this kind of harmful environment in which underqualified people are performing important tasks in corporations. Maybe more of a focus on those companies that have large government contracts, but it's this signal that somehow DEI has created this negative impact on the quality of the workforce in a company. And I think for compliance, it's like I said, maybe let's get away from the DEI label and just talk about discriminatory practice of unconscious bias, making sure that we're doing pay audits within the organization, taking a look at gender, race, and religious balances within the organization. What does our organization already contain? And are we providing a level playing field for our current employee base? And when we're recruiting, are we recruiting in a way that gets the best talent? Because I am all for what Trump says about having merit-based opportunity in the government and in a company, but that merit has to be predicated on a level playing field, on equal opportunity, on the ability for people from all different parts of the country to apply for, be employed, and succeed within the corporate environment.
Yeah, I love that. Hemma, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thank you. And Karen, I love the fact that you're framing this in terms of opportunities and challenges for us as compliance professionals, because I think that's exactly the way to look at it at this moment. One thing we don't want to do is disengage from the conversation. And you've highlighted a couple of ways of engaging. So first, you talked about what's the activity at the state level. I think it's really important for us as compliance professionals to be involved and understand what's happening at the state level as well. Whether you've got a policy arm of your team or you can do it yourself, my customers, our clients really want to know that we're engaged at that level. First and foremost, it really helps you articulate the whys behind some of the rules you're trying to enforce. So really good to stay in that conversation. But secondly, if there are things that need to evolve and develop, we can be part of that and influence that as well, and maybe take the voice of our clients and customers. On the DEI piece, again, must stay engaged. There is an opportunity right now to reframe the approach. And it's really, we've got to be very careful, all of us, not to rise up the ladder of influence. Just because there's a question about DEI practices doesn't mean that means women and minorities are not talented enough, of course, and you covered that. We need to think about staying at the bottom of the ladder of influence and asking ourselves what can be done differently. How are we doing hiring writ large, and what can we do to make sure we've got the best people and the right talent in the right places? So I just love the fact that you're highlighting the opportunity there for us. It's really important for us to lean in, be part of that conversation as well. It is going to be redefined. It's not a time for left or right outrage. It's definitely a time to stay in the conversation, see what needs to be corrected. I mean, I've been a DEI leader of sorts for a long time, but I can certainly give you some critical analysis about what could be done better. That doesn't mean we throw the baby out of the bathwater. We need to think about engaging in that conversation. And I suspect there'll be some middle ground if we do that at that lower rung of influence.
Yeah, I think that also one of the ways to do this is continuing to just go back to respect in the workplace, to go back to civility, to go back to some of the laws that still exist about discrimination and sexual harassment and all the things that we still have to, that we can count on in order to help us have conversations about the code of conduct, the ethical culture that we want, the values of the organization, things that are frankly less controversial sometimes and allow us to frame the same ideas in that way. Karen, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. Let's keep on the Karens. Karen, what do you want to talk about?
Sure. Hi, all. It's great to be here, especially with the Great Women in Compliance crossover. This is wonderful and I think very appropriate given what I think all of us are going to spend some time talking about, which is the impact of the last few weeks on what it's like to be a woman in compliance in some ways. What I want to talk about today is a little bit of a shift from what Karen Moore was talking about, but I think you'll see that there are some themes I think each of us will talk about here, which is how you sort of handle change. I think will be sort of one of the main themes. And so the thing that caught my eye that I wanted to discuss is actually a really minor change, and one that maybe doesn't even rise to the level of anyone sort of noticing. And certainly, to be fair, it hasn't been completely confirmed by those at the SEC. But it was reported this weekend that the CC and line prosecutors there have been told that they need to seek the approval of the full SEC commission before launching any formal probes. And so, again, a pretty minor shift. I mean, that is not unheard of maybe in the past, but the way that the norms have sort of evolved at the commission is that this is something that was deferred to some lower level enforcement attorneys. The commission had a bit of what we call maybe the right of refusal, like they would maybe shut something down. And like I said, that's a very small authority check, like a little tweak to the sort of typical, I think, way the commission has been running. But I do think it's worth noting because it does feel like just one extra degree in maybe the boiling of the frog here that we've seen for a number of years on this sort of slow entrenchment against the authority of the SEC writ large, even though this is internal to the SEC itself. But this, of course, comes on in the wake of a Republican-dominated SEC now, and one that I think will be ironically deregulatory, even though they are the SEC, but there'll be a much softer, I think, stance toward industry and toward sort of enforcement against any industry players at all. And so that slow entrenchment has been things like challenging, obviously, the ALJs, the administrative sort of judges when you are hauled into the SEC and sort of their in-house courts. That was one of the first major challenges. There's been challenges about the penalty power or lack thereof of the SEC. And then, of course, we saw in the last Supreme Court term a real sort of bombshell thrown in terms of any deference to any agency at all. So there's been, I think, this sort of steady drumbeat questioning the administrative state writ large, and this is no different. And so I think we've all been sort of trying to see how's that going to work now when the people who are sort of pro deregulation are now in charge of the agencies that are supposed to regulate. And I think this sort of, again, sort of small tweak that was sort of under maybe reported, and maybe we'll see how it plays out, is just one of those small changes, which is now the commission has to authorize any formal investigations. And like I said, that might not be a major shift. That certainly allows for SC enforcement attorneys to start doing some informal investigations. But with a formal investigation comes subpoena power and sort of the imprimatur of an SC investigation. And so the reason I sort of mention this, and like I said, I think this will dovetail some with what Hemma is going to talk about and others, is just in the wake of certainly this weekend, but then this sort of longer stretch in the last few weeks that we've seen that really, I think, challenges, honestly, the morale of civil servants. I'm from DC. I grew up in DC, and it's a scary and hard place to be right now for people who have spent their full careers. I mean, so many of my friends have been at the SEC for north of 5 years at least, if not some decades. And this is just sort of another chip away at their calling into question, maybe certainly their level of authority, but even just their competence, or even maybe suggesting that there are different goals here even within one agency. And I think that idea of just sort of demoralizing people who have spent their careers trying to do the right thing and trying to sort of, in this case, protect investors and ensure that at least the financial industry is well regulated. Again, like I said, I've been in DC a long time, so we've seen administrations come and go, and this is maybe no different. But I do think this, plus the sort of Doge idea and what's going on in the broader scenario in DC, is one that is really hard to sort of get your head around. And I think going forward will have significant repercussions in the compliance industry as well. But I don't have much more to say about that other than to sort of just highlight. We're going to see, I think, more and more little cuts into really questioning the ability of at least in the SEC, people who've been there the longest, and their ability to make calls and to have some level of authority. And so I think it's a very small red flag, but still one that I think merits a little bit of discussion as we think through what the administrative state is going to start to look like in the coming years. So it's very short. I didn't have much more to say about that than this, but I do think it's going to connect with some of the employee sort of culture to what Hemma is going to talk about. And then, like you said, the sort of just larger sweeping cultural shifts that we're going to see across certainly regulators and then the trickle down into also compliance personnel.
You might have a short amount to say about it, but I think the other women on this panel will have something to say as well. Lisa, let's start off with you. What are your thoughts?
First of all, it's always so fabulous to be with all of you and talking about all of these different issues. It makes my day. So thank you so much for doing this. I think there were two things that you mentioned, Karen, that really hit me, resonated. One is it is a small change, but it's also a death by paper cut for people who really are looking at these things. I think people forget, from not a political lens, but as much from this is what we should be doing as an agency to protect American people and people all over the globe. I think that's similar to some of what we do as compliance professionals. We try to stay neutral, and a lot of these government officials have done that over the years. And I think there is a concern that's separate from that I think we all have to keep in mind, that is not related to our views on certain issues, but the idea of what do these institutions stand for and what are they intended to do? And it is something that's different than what companies are doing or nonprofits or anything else. And maybe there are some legitimate redefinitions of those roles, but in the extreme of all or nothing, it's going to be a lot more of just not getting anything done. And it's not going to help that. I think the other point you raised, I also live in Washington, D.C. I have not been in the agencies personally in a very long time, but I think people do forget, like I was just saying, that the morale is difficult because it's very scary every day, but it feels a little bit, and we'll talk about it more later, a lot of jumping around in different things. And each one of these small things are happening in other agencies, things being closed and then reopened. I think that's a concern. And I think with DEI or other concerns, we want the best people to want to do different jobs regardless. Everybody agrees on that point, but we're not making the government a very palatable, safe place for people who want to do the right thing in it right now with some of that. And I think we need to keep that in mind as just a larger point. So I think those are my couple of points to raise there.
Yeah. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Hemma, you were in the SEC. Is that right? Okay, good. I'm remembering correctly. In your opinion, is this a sea change? Is it not a big deal? What is your thought process about this?
So I think perceptions are really important. And Karen, you talked about the theme being change management and employee engagement. I think we're going to cover both of those things. So certainly, what do they say? The one thing that's certain in life is change, or one constant is change. They also say criticism is the source of all change. So with those two things together, there can be room for lots of, whether it's outrage or panic or being unsettled, for sure. I have tons of empathy with that. But on the question of delegated authority, that's definitely something in the time I was there for 11 years from 2009 onwards. That's changed a couple of times during that period. So we've had that go back and forth. And it could be a red flag if you really mistrust the current commission, right? Having said that, this question of efficiency, it works both ways. So it's possible to say that if the staff are going in the wrong direction and running down and issuing subpoenas, there's a lot of work that's done before they get to the commission and find out the direction they're going to end up in, because the commission does have final say on every investigation. So why not get the direction now and avoid all of that? And I will say, one thing I was very reflective of when I worked at the SEC, of course, I don't speak for them, I cannot speak for them, but we had a lot of power. When we picked up that phone and said we were going to send a subpoena, we sent whole teams, not just in-house teams, but external teams running, and a lot of money was spent just to prepare to respond to a subpoena. We have to, with great power comes great responsibility. I do think just another perspective is we want to make sure that we're not going to be 4 or 5 years deep into an investigative process only to be told the commission didn't want us going that direction. And of course, it's not that simple. There's obviously lots of communication between the commission, the heads of enforcement, but this idea of delegated authority has swung both ways. And I think it could serve a purpose. It could serve a short purpose, an interim purpose, to let the commission decide which way it wants to go and then make sure that we are going that way. Now, if you don't trust the commission, that's going to be a red flag. But what else might be true? Maybe this is an efficiency that's needed, because no investigating attorney wants to spend a third of their career on a couple of cases that aren't going anywhere. So I think it can be quite helpful. So lots of ways to look at it. I understand, Karen, it's just another layer of things we can worry about. But back to that change management piece and our role as compliance professionals, I think we're going to have a really important role here in calming down all the inferences we can make from each change. I think that's something we're really going to have to think about in terms of what we can do to ask that question, what else might be true? Could this be good? Again, if we stay in the conversation, back to Karen Moore's point, we stay in the conversation, maybe we can influence it. And so as a former SEC official, if I were there now and I were to stay there, I would be asking how I could influence what types of cases we should be taking. And it really is a piece of advocacy. You get to go before the commission to talk about taking a certain type of case. It's for you to advocate as to why that's important. And maybe there'll be some bright lines. Maybe cryptocurrency is out. Maybe we don't want ephemeral messaging anymore. That might be where we go. But there will be many other cases that will keep that team busy, and they will have an opportunity to make that case. Then the commission can give an indicator that they're more or less likely to want to consider that type of policy. And let's be fair, the policy decisions should stay with the commission, not the individual enforcement officers. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. I don't want to forget the point you made about the impact on the employees. And that might be a nice segue, Kristy, into my piece on employee engagement. You are absolutely right, Karen. And I think Lisa said the same thing. The back and forth, the up and down, and the signaling, the perceptions of the signaling can be exhausting for our employees. And therefore, the SEC, attorneys and others may be feeling some kind of way. But the best of us have to find a way through that, right? Because otherwise, we're going to get massive employees engagement. So with that, I'll pause, Kristy. That's going to be my topic. But
And I think given where we are in the episode, let's just keep with it. Hemma, what do you want to talk about specifically?
So I want to talk about a Gallup poll, which is 2 weeks old, which feels like old news today, given that all the things have happened in the last 2 weeks. But 2 weeks ago, Gallup signaled that employee engagement in the US sunk to a 10-year low. Now, again, very controversial statement. It's loud. When you look into a little bit of detail, it is a 10-year low, but it's only 2% down from last year. What does 2% mean? It's a lot of people, right? We're talking about, I think they said, over 1.6 million per percentage point in terms of engagement. So I wanted to talk about that because I think that's something, again, been a theme of what we've heard from everyone today. The impact of all of this change on the employees, whether at the SEC or in our companies in-house, is significant. And I actually think it's a bipartisan issue, right? Everybody cares about employee engagement because in the end, happy employees make happy customers. We're talking about profit here. We're talking about retention. It does boil down to money. And so while it doesn't feel that way necessarily, when we get things like the Gallup poll saying employee engagement is down to an all-time low, I think this is something we can all get behind and ask ourselves, what role can we play in helping that inch back up? That's really important that we reverse that trend, whether in the US or beyond. Now, there's 12 engagement elements in this Gallup poll, and they said that the most significant declines in 2024. And again, just to be clear, this is a poll from 2024, so it's not a recent number. They talked about clarity of expectations being lower, feeling someone at work cares about them as a person being lower, and someone encouraging development. There's some good clues in the actual engagement factors that they use, and something we can think about as we, as compliance officers, culture builders, work cross-functionally to try to improve this. Another highlight was said that workers younger than 35 seem to be most affected. And that's, again, a question in terms of be more interested than interesting, a question we're going to have to ask. What do we need to pay attention to there when it comes to a certain generation of workers? There were certainly specific industries as well. I think it was finance, insurance, transportation, technology, and professional services sectors. Those rose to the top. And depending on where you work, you might be having to lean in a little bit more. There's a broader economic context as well, but it turns out that employee engagement numbers went up in the first half of 2024, can't say it, and then declined a little bit in the 6 months after. They attributed it to 4 things. And I think this is really interesting for us to look at. One, rapid organizational change. So there, no surprises. The change we're seeing at pace is one of the main reasons. Challenges from hybrid and remote work transitions, which I want to go into a little bit more. New customer and employee expectations, and broken performance management practices. Now, each of those topics could be one on their own. I want to focus in on remote work transitions because that is something that's come up again in the last couple of weeks. Matt Kelly, one of our friends from Radical Compliance, he wrote an article on January 28th called Corporate Culture Under Strain. And he flagged, for example, the JP Morgan decision to go full back into the office 5 days a week. Not just that, but he flagged that there was a lot of unrest when it came to the employees on some internal communications channel. And JP Morgan decided to shut that channel down to stop that conversation. So that, as compliance professionals, makes us think about, hold on, what about our culture and our speak up culture? We do a lot of work and spend a lot of resources in making sure our employees know that we are willing to hear and we want to listen to you. But Matt brought up the issues, like what really are we willing to hear and what do we not want to hear? And that's certainly something I've had to wrestle with as an in-house counsel as well. It's just because employees are speaking up doesn't mean we should necessarily open the channels. And we certainly had good debates as to whether or not certain topics were open forum. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because it does trouble me in terms of how we can say from one side of our mouths, we want to speak up culture, we want to be listeners. And on the other, we can say, well, for various reasons, we've decided to shut down those communications. I think that's going to become more and more common as we see employee disengagement. We're going to have employees wanting to talk about policy changes and share their feelings on it. And we have to decide as compliance officers and culture builders, what can we do about that? And are we going to hear? So I'm going to pause there and maybe invite the others of you, because these are more questions than answers. I don't have any strong views. I have strong feelings, but not necessarily strong views. I'd love, Kristy, to hear from the others as to what they think the impact of the return to work is on culture, and shutting down communications could be on culture. And how can the two things sit together? How can we have some controls, but also keep the idea of a speak up culture alive?
Yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. I would note that a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal put out an article on trends in return to work. And they said that all in the office has actually gone down about 9% from last year. And that also fully remote has gone down. And really many companies are moving to a hybrid model. I wonder personally how that affects talent acquisition and being able to get people either to move or to have to go in-house. There's a lot of interesting debate there. But also, culture is also catching. And when you have super negative people, that can really affect culture too. So from the JP Morgan side, I can understand that really when somebody starts to talk about every bad thing in this place and how horrible it is, that can really affect culture too, and very quickly. I don't know. I mean, I don't agree with necessarily shutting down the commentary. And I think maybe there's a difference between listening at a corporate level and producing negativity everywhere. I don't know. Karen Moore, what think you?
Well, I think we could have a whole episode, maybe we should, on return to work. There's a lot of complexity there. And I have a lot of sympathy and understanding for companies that want people back in the office. I also think for compliance professionals, it's really hard to get people to drink the Kool-Aid on corporate culture if they're not actually in the office and interacting and observing, because we talk a lot about leading by examples. Kind of a big fan of being in the office on the one hand. On the other hand, I also think that during the pandemic, we had this tremendous opportunity, this grand experiment in education and in corporate world and in government even, to start examining what does the workforce look like and what do they need. And the ability to accommodate people that maybe needed a little bit more flexibility or needed to be at home because of aging parents or young school children, or what have you, it started to present this opportunity to rethink what does work look like and what does the workforce look like. And I'm kind of sad that conversation hasn't endured as we struggle with the need to get people back to the office or positive benefits of getting people back to the office. I think there are a whole bunch of risks that many of us have grappled with on the remote working. Those needed to be examined and continue to need to be examined more closely. But kind of a knee-jerk return to work, I think sometimes maybe hides that opportunity to discuss what does a workforce look like and how can we benefit the most by this kind of maybe hybrid situation. Although hybrid's kind of hard if Hemma and I are working on different days and we never are in the office at the same time.
So many complexities. Lisa, what think you?
I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think when we talk about organizational culture, it really is important. It depends on where you work, whether it is actually an in-person culture to begin with. My organization had a lot of different places, locations. We have an office. If I go into the office in DC, I'm almost never there with anybody I would ever work with. Whereas if it's a Zoom comfortable thing. I think there are some problems with that. I would like to do that more, but I think talking about it as in sort of this is what office culture is, sometimes forgets how that works best. I mean, and for many of us who work with people all over the world, I think we do more building culture. For example, if I have to do an investigation talking to someone in China, if I do it at 9 o'clock my time at night, which would be 9 a.m. their time, people are much happier to speak to me than I'm like, I am in the office from these hours, so I'm sorry it's midnight for you. I think there's a lot to be thought about from in the nuances of it, and I don't think people are having that discussion in the way that they should. It becomes we have to collaborate. Who are you collaborating with, and what? I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind. I think not being heard about that may move people's views on that down. I think that's one of my biggest points on company culture, and I just think generally these various changes from we're going to tell everyone they can work at home all the time till a couple of years later saying, okay, we hired you, but now you need to be in an office is also a hard thing. And the last point that I would make for those looking for jobs or thinking about culture or their own personal happiness on this is if you're looking at an organization and everybody there, they say you can be remote, but everyone is in the office. Think about whether that's going to work for you, work for them, or be successful. Just again, it goes back to that culture point. If just because you can do it, because they say we can't find the right person in the right city or state, doesn't mean you're not essentially going to accidentally end up moving for 6 months to start a job. And I think you really ought to keep all of those things in mind. But this sort of, we're going back to work into the office 5 days a week, ignoring some of those other concerns, I think also leads to a bit of a morale dump, for lack of a better term.
Morale dump. That's a great series of words. Karen, other Karen, what do you think?
I was just going to echo a lot of what Lisa was saying, because I do think at base, this all just circles the drain of how much there is a foundation of trust of workers and management. It's the return to work and sort of even the speak up culture, or I think sort of how that trust is put into practice or not. And so I think the return to work calls into question some of, are you actually working? Are you doing this? I do think there's so many more factors in both of these issues, lease amount, just being able to plan for office space and things like that. So I totally sympathize with the management side of this, as well as with the employees, especially if it comes down to expectations. If you thought you were going to be able to work remotely and you had set up your life that way, then that does feel like a bait and switch a little bit, or certainly like you don't trust your employees to be doing that. But I think it's fair to say about even this speak up culture. I hear what you're saying, Kristy, about this speak up, maybe don't, if all you have to say is something negative. But I think it does. I think foundationally, this all comes back to the culture. And I agree that culture is formed and hopefully disseminated when we can be together. I just don't know if that is necessary to always have to be face to face. I think we've learned since COVID that is possible to be done. But to your point, Lisa, I think it's the sort of shift and the shift in expectations and the shift without maybe much warning that is really being felt sort of across, honestly, the country. And certainly my cousin is a federal worker in Denver. She's actually a volcanologist. She studies when the volcano might go off. But she emailed me all these things. Do I need to get a lawyer because of this resign email? And because I thought I could work, I set up my childcare to not be in the office every day. And I just think, I thought for her, it's so demoralizing. You're someone who has a PhD and has worked her whole life studying rocks or whatever. And all of her career sort of being sort of carelessly handled and over sort of things that feel just on the margins. And so it's hard to see sort of that level of morale tank and just confusion. I think it's been heartbreaking. But anyway, that's all I'll say about that.
Well, it segues nicely. Morale, destruction, and confusion segue nicely into what Lisa Fine wants to talk about. Lisa!
Morale, destruction, and confusion. That might be my new tagline, but I am going to throw in one other small point on what we were just talking about, because I neglected to mention it earlier. And I think it's also important about speaking up. I think that it is important that we hear from people, and I'm going to kind of come back to this in a second, and that people can raise concerns. That doesn't mean they should be able to raise them everywhere at every time and in every instance. And I'm just going to give a quick little anecdote. When we had a prior CEO start, we had an Ask Andy. And people had a lot of great questions. Then it degenerated into questions like, what's my schedule? Why did they change the office policies? Now, they had every right to be raised those concerns and hear that. But the lease for a test center or something, I don't even know if that's a real example. But at a certain point, do you really need that stuff to be everywhere all the time? So I think it's again, never an all or nothing. I guess that's what we learn after this many years in this world. And with that, to talk about destruction, confusion, and other things, I mean, and I live in Washington, D.C., as I've mentioned. And the first thing I want to say is it's been a very unusual couple of weeks for lots of reasons. And then we've had a tragedy here, regardless of the politics or the thoughts of it anywhere else. 67 people died in a plane crash last week. There was what we know. And according to the FAA and according to it's too early to say all the things that people may be saying, but we do know a couple of things for sure. First of all, this is just a horrible thing to have happened and really scary when you realize how close it is. I live, 2 to 3 miles or 5 miles from the airport. People can see it in the air. I mean, this is real life. But the couple things we do know from a preliminary report was that there have been other incidents that people have raised helicopter concerns as recently as the night before this, and that typically, or some of the time, there was one air controller doing 2 jobs where you may have had 2 people in the past. That whether that is an issue or it was okay, we don't know. So we don't know a lot of things, but there's a couple of things just that we can keep in mind about what we do and who we are. And the first one is one of the most important things that we do in compliance is try to help keep people safe and do the right thing whenever we can. And that includes the raising of concerns and the speaking up. Now, we don't know if anybody was raising these things. It's too soon. Or would that prevent? We don't know any of these things. I keep saying that because I don't want this in a different way. But when you start deciding where you limit things or how you make those decisions, they have real consequences. And sometimes they can be tragic. So as we go through this, a conversation of root cause, we have to hope is truly a root cause analysis to avoid another airline death, which I think they said they hadn't had a passenger one quite like this in 30 years. But that also makes me think about the fact that when things go smoothly for long enough, sometimes people think, okay, why are we doing this, that, or the other? And we can see it in very small contexts all the time in our jobs. I mean, sales or other things, while important to our jobs, our livelihoods and things like that, it's not the same as airplane transportation safety. But looking at those things and what the real risks are, they can come out. And I think that's one of the things in that point. The second point, which is not entirely related, but kind of comes around at the same time and adds to the feeling of this confusion and other things, is there have been so many executive orders that have come out in the last couple of weeks, regardless of the substance of them, regardless of your views on what they are. They provide a lot of uncertainty and confusion for those who are trying to figure out what the rules are, what's appropriate, what is still allowed, and who is governing those things. You don't know right now. And then we go back to the DEI example. Who is actually going out and what are their intents? You don't know. And you don't know how to respond and what the appropriate way. So there's both things like Hemma was saying, going back and talking to your organizations and figuring out what to do. There's also a question of understanding what the playing field is. And that is changing almost hourly, even just today, seeing what's happening with tariffs. So one day you're preparing for things that may happen. And in my former life with food servicing, if you're preparing for tariffs for a lot of your foods from Mexico and or Canada, particularly Mexico right now, and then you're thinking, okay, we've got plan A, B, and C, and then, okay, it might be pushed back a month. You're figuring out how to keep doing your job, doing what you're asked to do, at the same time, not knowing where the ground is shifting. And I think that is very scary and very problematic, both, for organizations and for all of us, frankly. And hopefully, there will be court challenges, there'll be administrative challenges, there'll be everything. And will we actually figure out what's getting done, and how do we make sure that we take this and come back to avoid what isn't gamesmanship, but could potentially be like really difficult consequences. So this may not be the most organized set of points I've ever had for everything compliance. Hopefully I'll live with it, but I think they're all coming back to this sort of big picture unease and hoping that we can really try to move forward on that. So that was my take on it. Maybe a little emotional.
A little emotional is good, I think, sometimes, especially because it makes people understand just how big a deal it is. I had two comments on this. The first one is there was a study that I read that absolutely fascinated me that studied women with breast cancer diagnoses, and they found that they were more comfortable and happier after they knew one way or the other. And that was shocking to me because those women who had positive diagnoses, right? They felt at least like they had agency and they could do something or could make a plan. And that in between period where you don't know something, humans are terrible with it and very uncomfortable. And you can't blame them for that. So I think that the lesson for our organizations, especially if you have something like we're doing risk assessments constantly for where we've had some of our client have acquisitions. And the response is either positive or negative frequently in those interviews with, yes, they told me what was going on. Yes, I did or didn't like it, but at least I understood the process and the why and all the rest of it versus this was thrown on me. I don't know who my boss is. I don't know who to talk to. I don't know what's happening and every day I'm insecure. I think that creates culture, culture shifts, right? You're already trying to bring them in. And if they don't feel like they're being respected, that's a problem. So I think if you're going to have these major shifts, whether it's by executive order or in your organization, that communications plan, thinking through how this is actually going to work is pretty darn critical. Hemma, what do you think?
This reminds me of the first time I sat with you beautiful ladies for Everything Compliance, because we were talking about board responsibility. And I don't know if you remember, we were talking about Boeing and the Bluebell ice cream, lots of tragedy when it comes to our profession. And I think it's fair to say that all of us have risen to these roles because we care about these things. So just wanted to comment that it reminds me that the tragedies are there, and all we can do is try to do our best to make sure we are doing our part in that. And it's very moved again. I don't know very far from where the incident happened, but I do think, Lisa, you're right. It reminds us every day that what we do is important, and we should always be curious and interested in how we can help prevent those things. So that was number one. And I, again, look back to the executive orders, back to change management. Right. And we can't even manage change yet because we don't know what the change is. So I think there's a spot before change management, which is anticipation of change management. And so I laugh, but, I think that, again, more and more, if change is only constant, we have to manage that place where we don't know. And I dare say, and I haven't read every executive order and I haven't read every law that might be changing, we might not need to move too fast. I mean, we're not known for moving that fast anyway as lawyers and compliance officers, but the chances are things are going to have to come up and then settle. And I'm hoping that's the case. I'm hoping none of us are immediately non-compliant. I suspect the sanctions lawyers with the strict liability are worried more than others will be. So definitely get your good outside counsel. But yeah, I don't have the answers. But certainly as I hear you talk, I think to myself, gosh, how are we being intentional and deliberate about anticipatory change management and keeping employees and the people we serve, the customers, with some ease and peace of mind, my favorite phrase, and reassuring them that together we can do hard things well, knowing full well that hard things are coming and they won't stop. It's really just what I'm thinking as I listen to you. So thank you.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense to me, Hemma. I think that if you are in a position like sanctions, where you might need to call your supplier or call your team and say, by the way, our supplier, we can't work with them and they're a major supplier, and now what? If you have anticipatory change management that you need, but you have a plan for that, perhaps you even have communications experts on hand or a PR person, there's a lot that we can do to try to make this better. So fabulous conversations today. Let us turn to our fan favorite, which is rants and raves. I am going to start today, and then I'll go back in order of who we talked to previously. So there's definitely tragedy in Washington, D.C. There's also been tragedy in Los Angeles, which is where I live, south of Los Angeles, about 45 minutes from the fires. So I'm very grateful. I have both a rant and a rave. The rant is, what the heck are you doing looting people? That is so awful. It's impossible to understand. But the bigger thing is the raves, and we're called the City of Angels, and people don't think of us that way, but there's been unbelievable outpouring of love, of money, of care. We personally, my family, supported the Humane Society of Pasadena, where all those animals are being taken, and one of the fire stations. When I look at how the city has responded and how much love and care, I just am really proud to live here. Congratulations to everyone in the City of Angels that's helping. I really, truly appreciate you. Karen Moore, let's start with you. What's your rant and rave? Nope, you're on mute. Come back.
Terrible. I would like to rave about a very small treatise. It's a 2017 book by a history professor at Yale, Timothy Snyder. It's called On Tyranny. It's small. You can see it's very small. It's very motivating. It's a real call to action. And I just highly recommend it. It goes back into the not so distant past to see if there's some lessons that we can learn about tyranny. I mean, I make no apologies about my politics, but I think any of us maybe will just feel good about some of the things that we can do and that we should be doing and things that we should be paying attention to in today's climate. So my rave is On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. Small book, easy read, very motivating.
All right, everybody, put it on your list. Karen Woody.
I thought I was gonna have some rants today because of just gestures broadly. But I think we all have sort of that same level of just malaise. And so maybe we do need to have a rave or a shout out. And so I guess I will shout out to Beyonce, who finally got her album of the year last night, and in the country category, the first Black person to ever have that, had that award bestowed upon them. And so in what might be one of, I think, a few moments of light in the last couple of weeks, I will point to that one.
All righty, everybody loves Queen Bee. Hemma, let's say
I have a fabulous double rave. Sorry. Double rave and a tiny rant. Okay, so my first rave is I got to see my friend Lisa last week in DC. That would be rave enough. I could pause right there. But we both attended a CICO, a Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer boot camp. It was put on by Gravitas, the search agency, Kirkland & Ellis, the law firm. And they brought together, I don't know how many, maybe 50 to 100 of us, compliance professionals, aspiring CCOs and some other CCOs, to learn and convene and commune. So that was like my favorite thing to do, and to see Lisa on top of it was wonderful. Although I didn't save you a seat at the front, so I feel bad, but we did really well to see each other. Double, I said double because you may know that I have two little girls, 6 and 9 years old. And yesterday they had their first skiing lesson with none other than Auntie Karen Moore. I got to see Karen yesterday. She was able to take my kids up onto the chairlift and bring them down safely. So thank you. I mean, what a treat. I'm still reading from how wonderful that was. So great to see you on the slopes. I can't wait to do it again with you. So that's my...
They are so adorable, Hemma. They are mini yous.
Oh, well,
Charles.
double trouble on the slopes of Pennsylvania, but there you go. And then my mini rant then is that Kristy and Karen Woody, I haven't seen you this week.
we're doing a session at Compliance Week. So we
Boston. Yes.
Boston on stage together in March. Small plug for that. Come join us. It's going to be awesome. Okay. And let's finish off with Lisa Fine.
I feel like I can't really compare to all of that nice stuff, but I have a little rant that's admittedly a little personal. It's the NFL referees. I feel that they need to have some more help and training, given that, I mean, I'm a little upset about the Bills, but I wouldn't have been if I felt that we were legitimately beaten. But I really do think that I'm not happy with the NFL referees. I know they're probably losing sleep over this right now, but the Bills Mafia is not happy with that. So I had to rant on that. My rave is also completely unrelated to compliance or anything else, but I have been doing these improv classes for the last year. I've mentioned them once or twice, and now we're doing this thing called the Herald, it's called the Herald because no one knew what to call it, so they named it Herald, which apparently upset the guy who's now, this is his legacy. But I will say, doing something like that for a few hours every week with people I don't know and laughing and getting to know people that have zero to do with anything, and at a time like this, it's really fun. And I would strongly encourage, not necessarily improv, unless that's something people are interested in, but something like that in times where you do feel the malaise. Every time when I'm on my way there, I'm like, oh God, this is 2 hours. I could do something else. And every time on my way home, I'm like, this was the best. So I just want to say, I'm giving a rave to improv and any other activities. Kristy, I know you have the silks and all this cool stuff, and everybody does. But I just think that's my rave.
Improv. Getting on the silks every week, 3 times a week now is my favorite time because you can't think of anything else when you're hanging from the ceiling 16 feet up. So I'm pretty sure that is a good finish here for the great women in compliance, telling you to go find something fun because honestly, there's a lot going on right now. Thank you, great women in compliance, Karen, Hemma, and Lisa. Thank you, everything compliant. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Kristy.